Ladies and gentlemen, our first guest tonight has the best job in show business. This fall, he will star as the new James Bond in the motion picture GoldenEye. I had that when I was a kid. Do you have that?
GoldenEye.
It's like conjunctivitis.
Can't get rid of it. Hard to get rid of it.
You get some drops, and it goes right away.
That's right.
Sure. Ladies and gentlemen, please do us a favor. Welcome now, Agent 007, Pierce Brosnan.
And so Pierce Brosnan assumed the role of 007. The announcement of him getting the role was pretty much universally greeted with enthusiasm. He was practically everyone's choice to be Bond, and along with the bizarre events surrounding his initial casting and it falling apart back in 1986, Brosnan finally getting the role seemed long overdue. I was in the disappointed minority when it came out Dalton wasn't returning. If you've been following this review series, you probably know I liked him and was looking forward to seeing him do a third Bond outing and see what adventures awaited his 007. There was a loose rule of film number 3 with the Bond actors.
Do you expect me to talk?
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
The theory was their third outing as Bond would result in one of the best and most memorable Bond films in the series, and would mark the point of really establishing them as the new 007. It was sort of like that Star Trek rule of the even-numbered films being the good ones. Lazenby never made it to his second, Dalton never got to his third, so the rule of 3 was still kind of active. Let me say up front, I was never a big Brosnan fan. I had seen several of his late 80s, early 90s action films, and Remington Steele, and he never really stuck out at me. I know he has a lot of fans, but for me, I never got his allure. It's just personal taste. Some of the most popular actors that everyone seems to enjoy watching, I simply don't get, and their charisma that attracts their fans just escapes me. With all the excitement of finally a new Bond film coming out, though, and after such a long wait, and the announcement of new cast members, a new director, Brosnan finally getting his long overdue shot, and the promises of a Bond for the 90s, it was hard not to be eager to see what was coming. GoldenEye was the first theatrical Bond film for a lot of fans. Because of the extended gap between films, it was the first opportunity for a lot of them to finally venture out to the theater and see a James Bond film on the big screen for the first time. This cinematic experience has become one of those ongoing, shared events of youth for generations of movie fans. Since the series hit screens in 1962, young fans would flock to see the latest James Bond film, and cheer at the adventures of their James Bond that they would grow up watching. I'd bet most Bond fans can recall their first Bond movie they saw in the theater. So Martin Campbell would direct, Brosnan would star, and the long-awaited return of Bond would commence. This, plus the fact the film inspiring a video game that was very popular, don't know anything about it, never played it, helped make the return of Bond a huge success, and he would eventually recruit a new generation of fans. At this point, there had been a lot of uneasiness that the Bond character was finished, that he was an outdated character that should have been put to rest. The character was created at the height of the Cold War, and now with the change in the political landscape, some thought Bond was, like stated in the film, a relic whose time was over. I never thought Bond would have much trouble adapting to whatever the current political climate the world was in. Sure, the films could reflect whatever the real-world villains there are, but Bond fighting against the Russians only happened in a handful of films. The rest of the time it's been fictional evil organizations, rich, greedy, powerful guys, and Blofeld. Look, he was trying to stop Drax's Noah's Ark spaceship not too long ago. There have been, and always will be, bad guys in the world, and we will always need heroes to protect us from them. So I never really doubted that we could continue watching 007 adventures. With Bond films, you have to have a definite suspension of disbelief with them. If you're not going to accept that the big Japanese guy can guillotine heads off with his hat, that Bond's car can turn into a submarine, and that he can survive a huge avalanche, you might as well sit the whole thing out. But the thing is, I can only go so far in the world of Bond. And when they push things a bit too far in the reality of his world, that's when it will lose me. Typically, the films run this cycle of becoming so overboard and so hard to swallow that the filmmakers have no other choice but to go back to basics in the next one. This was the solution when Moore left and Dalton picked things up. While Moore was this fantastical character in over-the-top situations with large doses of humor, Dalton stripped all that away and went back to the original idea of Fleming's, of a more reality-based kind of spy. This time out, it would be different. Dalton's films were so realistic and so dramatic that GoldenEye would try to lighten things up a bit and try to bring back some of the fun some fans missed. Brosnan was expected to be the best of both worlds of Bond. He would be equal parts Connery and Moore, along with dashes of Dalton and Lazenby, I guess. But he was meant to be a successful combination of all the things that fans wanted from their James Bond. GoldenEye would also mark Cubby Broccoli's final credit on a Bond film. He was already in ill health during filming and would only be credited as presenter. The bulk of producing duties were handled by his children, Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, who would continue their producer roles on every Bond film after Broccoli's death in 1996. By the way, at this point the films had used up most of Fleming's Bond titles and would have to create their own. Using the title GoldenEye was not a random choice, but it would be a nod to Bond's creator, who named his Jamaican home GoldenEye. So the film opens with the required pre-credit sequence. Bond makes a very high bungee jump. We get our first intro of Pierce. We meet 006, who soon gets caught and quickly gets a bullet in his head by our secondary villain of the film, General Ormov. The odds are against Bond of making it out of this place alive, but he makes an incredible escape, and the title sequence begins. Okay, so let's back up here. The bungee jump is a really cool stunt. It's something we haven't seen in a Bond film before, and it opens the film up with a nice wow moment. What always bothered me was Brosnan's introduction to the audience. It's really not a great memorable first screen appearance of a Bond. Like, look at the Bonds in the past. We got the classic buildup of shots of Connery playing cards and lighting a cigarette before he's shown introducing himself. Lazenby, another buildup of shots spying a woman on the beach. He rescues his future wife from a suicide attempt before introducing himself. Then you got Roger Moore. He's just seen laying in bed with a hot brunette. Dalton dramatically turning towards the camera, witnessing one of his colleagues fall to his death before he jumps into action. Then we get Brosnan. Again, we have a gradual buildup of shots getting hints of him, and then the big reveal of him hanging upside down in a Russian stall, giving a silly one-liner to a soldier taking a dump.
Beg your pardon? Forgot to knock.
I always thought they could have come up with a better intro for his first on-screen appearance. Anyway, 006, Alec Trevelyan, and Bond make their way to the target together and prepare to blow up the joint. Now, Alec is going to be Bond's nemesis in the story, and it's a really cool idea of Bond going up against a former agent and friend. It's something we haven't seen before. We got a villain who's going to know Bond, know all the tricks of being a 00, and is going to give Bond a real personal conflict in the story. So this scene is really the only part of the film that will establish that these guys are friends and partners and can anticipate how the other will think from their shared history together. A lot of their exchanges just feel routine and never gave me the idea that these guys care for each other, or are at least friends. Granted, the film doesn't have a lot of time to play up the setup, so they generally fall back on quick shorthand remarks to each other to show this isn't the first time they've worked with each other, and this is another mission they're on. Then we get this remark from Bond.
Closing time, James! Last score! Buy me a pint!
That just doesn't seem like something James Bond would say. We get introduced to General Ormov, who I always thought of as an updated version of General Orloff. Alec gets shot, and Bond quickly devises a way to get out of there. It's a really good scene. It has some humor and some real excitement to it, seeing all those barrels fly at the bad guys. Then suddenly we end up here. I don't know where we're at. Bond is suddenly running down a snow-covered runway after a plane with the bad guys right behind him. This always confused me. The first time I saw it, I thought the projector goofed up and jumped to the last part of the film. From the establishing shots of the bungee jump stunt, the geography of the surrounding area doesn't look anything like this. Nothing resembles this from the opening shots of the film. I know Bond jumped on that conveyor belt to escape, but how far did this thing take him? Was he riding on this thing for miles before he ended up here? I never got it. I'm guessing the radical change of scenery probably just looked cooler for the finale of the opening. The filmmakers probably thought, yeah, Bond is running around and the snow is kicking up, and it'll just look cool. It might not match the dam we found for the bungee jump, but hopefully no one will notice. So then we get the climactic escape of Bond riding the motorcycle off the cliff and skydiving after the airplane. This would have been a really cool stunt, probably one of the best in the series. Too bad they decided to add this terrible looking blue screen shot of Brosnan falling alongside the plane. I remember in the theater the audience laughing at this. The one thing about the great stunts in the earlier Bond films were they were done for real. There was a real guy driving the car or falling out of the plane. Of course, you know it's not really Connery or Moore or whoever, and even if they had some hokey effect of inserting the actor into it, you could at least always appreciate the physical stunt itself. And that's what audiences will be rewatching and be wowed by years later. Like the bungee jump leap. That's the stunt from GoldenEye that's going to hold up. I think if they had tried to do this stunt 15, 20 years earlier, the filmmakers would have had to try to sell the idea in a different way. Maybe filming it differently or something. It's like the less tools you have at your disposal, the more creative it forces you to be. And while I can appreciate the fact that the film is trying to convince you Brosnan is actually falling after the plane, it doesn't sell it at all, and as a result, at least for me, it just makes the whole thing look pretty ridiculous and is not a great capper to the opening. It's really dangerous to overthink things too much in a Bond movie, but I can't help myself whenever I rewatch this opening. I always assumed Alec had staged his death from Orloff in front of Bond, so Bond would return to MI6 and confirm to them that he was indeed dead. But the more I think about it, the less sense it makes. It seems like an overly complicated way to fake his death. He meets up with Bond, shoots some of Orloff's men, shoots more of his men. Orloff shoots him with a blank. Maybe he puts real bullets back in his gun off camera. And they hope that Bond will be able to escape while avoiding all of Orloff's bad guys who are shooting at him. I guess beforehand Orloff didn't tell them to just let this guy go. What would they have done if Bond was inadvertently killed? Would Alec just have gotten up and said, "Bummer, that plan didn't work"? Why wouldn't Alec just kill Bond right when he sees him? They both would never return to MI6, and MI6 would assume that they were both killed on their mission. Or was the whole faking the death idea just agreed on when Alec got caught by Orloff? Or could it have been that Alec really got shot by Orloff? Then why does Orloff order his men to stop shooting at Bond?
Hold your fire! Wait!
I don't know. The pre-credits used to be a lot less complicated. Maurice Binder had died, and the duties of the opening title sequence fell onto the shoulders of Daniel Kleinman. Gone were the old-fashioned techniques that Binder employed, and now computer graphics did most of the work. And it's pretty good. This credit sequence plays on the post-Cold War setting with images of Soviet monuments being destroyed. while still incorporating the required guns and silhouetted hot chicks. The theme song, sung by Tina Turner, who you could say is a modern-day Shirley Bassey, isn't all that great, although it is my favorite of all the Brosnan theme songs. Actually, the music in the film fluctuates between pretty good to pretty horrible. The GoldenEye overture is pretty cool with that rhythmic, distant beat, and some of the other music that kind of combines orchestra and electronic sound. It's a nice updating of the Bond music. But then there's music that's really... well, I'll get to it. I guess I'm just old-fashioned and miss the John Barry tunes. We move forward 9 years later and see the return of the Aston Martin. I always thought the choice of years we skipped was somewhat ironic in the context of the history of the films. We are now in 1995. 9 years earlier, the Bungie pre-credit sequence took place. So that would make it 1986. About the same time Roger Moore had left the role and Timothy Dalton became the new Bond. It's kind of strange. If you were really cynical, you would say the filmmakers were consciously skipping over the Dalton phase completely for audiences. If you were cynical. The film doesn't waste time to get started on the promised deeper examination of Bond, dropping us in the middle of him being evaluated.
James, stop this. Stop it! I know what you're doing.
Really? What's that, dear?
You are just trying to show off the size of your
Engine?
ego.
We are having a pleasant drive in the country, and you've got to bring psychology into it.
We meet one of the best femme fatales in the series, Xenia Onatopp, played by Famke Janssen. She's hot, smart, strong, and is a real threat. Her gimmick of squeezing guys to death between her legs and the pleasure she gets from killing is a lot of fun. And she's got the sexy sounding name, too.
Onatopp?
Onatopp.
I wish the film used more of Xenia, actually. The race between her Ferrari and Bond's Aston Martin uses one of the worst pieces of music in it, though. I don't know why they chose it. This song might be appropriate for something, but not for a James Bond film. It just doesn't work. Brosnan immediately does a costume change for the casino scene, and we finally see him in his Bond tux. The tux and Bond go hand in hand, and all the past Bonds could fill out their tuxes pretty good. But maybe it's because of his slight build or something, but Brosnan always looked more like a waiter than 007 to me. He doesn't really have a very commanding presence. Not to pick on the guy, but I just think he looks like a lightweight compared to past Bonds. Brosnan might have been everyone's perfect choice for the part, but he's so seemingly perfect he becomes bland. His performance of Bond isn't really that exciting. He obviously was eager to finally be given the role, but he looks like he's just trying way too hard to hit all the marks Bond fans expected. It's like he's trying to act cool and tough and witty, and it all feels very forced and just going through the motions of it all. Past Bond actors would bring something new to their interpretation of the character. Here, Brosnan just seems like a safe, crowd-pleasing Bond. It also doesn't help that he's not given that much to play other than to be James Bond. He does this sighing thing and pursing his lips together after a lot of his dialogue, too. Which, after I first noticed this quirk, it just started to become a distraction. The other big part in the film is, of course, the Bond girl. This time a Russian computer programmer, Natalia, played by Izabella Scorupco, who I think is one of the best Bond girls in a long time. Everyone knows the dilemma of Bond getting a leading lady whose sole purpose in the film is just to look good. They're not as much characters as they are decorative devices that need saving. Gradually, the politically correct line of thinking had to fix this, and Bond's leading ladies had to become more capable and intelligent, and who had more of a purpose in the film besides her bikini scene.
I'm looking for Dr. Goodhead.
You just found her.
A woman?
The easiest way to do this was to give her an important position of power and make her seemingly an equal to Bond. So say she's another secret agent, or a scientist, or a state geologist.
That's incredibly dangerous.
We're expected to think that she's smart. But this doesn't necessarily work if there's still a screaming, clumsy damsel in distress and just becomes a lovely ball and chain that Bond carries throughout the film. But the character of Natalia is none of that. She doesn't have any big, fancy job, but through the course of the film she proves she's an extremely capable character. Sure, she needs saving from time to time, but she doesn't really need Bond as much as past Bond girls did. She survives the office attack, she has a tough attitude when pushed, and her talents don't just stop at her job title of being a computer programmer. But we see it in other ways, like how she cons her way in and out of situations. She also has a nice sense of humor, and she's really hot. I definitely think she's the best leading lady of the Brosnan Age.
You were saying?
No, I was just...
Good. Because if I want sarcasm, Mr. Tanner, I'll talk to my children. Thank you very much.
Actually, this time out, the film consciously made an effort to make their female characters stand out much more than usual. The big example of this is Judi Dench as the new M. At the time, this was a huge deal. James Bond's boss is a woman. Oh my God. But I never thought it was such a radical change as apparently everyone else did. It would have been much crazier had they changed 007 to a female agent, which was one of the rumors floating around during the 6-year hiatus. That's where the rumors of Sharon Stone and Emma Thompson being cast came from. For some reason, it always felt to me that it was a much bigger deal recasting the Q character.
Are these pictures live?
Unlike the American government, we prefer not to get our bad news from CNN.
But Dench is good. Visually, the character of M stands out much more barking orders in a room full of men. And she is able to deal out missions and dialogue with a nice, cold, icy stare that would have made Bernard Lee proud. Although her scene with Bond might have been an attempt to deconstruct the character a bit and plop him down in this new era, it doesn't go much further than this scene. In fact, most of the dissection of the character's traits and the fact he is a dinosaur from a bygone era doesn't really seem to go anywhere. They all seem to be included more for the audience's benefit than anything. None of it impacts on how Bond, the character, will act throughout the story. Bond and the story don't seem like it would have been much different had this story been told 20 years earlier. Bond never really tries to adapt throughout the film. Even during the climax, when he knows Alec knows everything about him, and even after Alec told him,
Oh, please, James, put it away. It's insulting to think I haven't anticipated your every move.
Bond doesn't ever try to switch things up and is ready to throw Alec for a loop. Like the watch scene. Alec easily disarms Bond's plan and probably saw it coming from miles away. Even when he was facing Elliot Carver, Bond was ready for some surprises for the guy.
You see, Mr. Bond, I have a backup plan.
Uh-huh. So do I.
Bond eventually triumphs in the story, not from altering from his normal actions, but by plain luck, when Boris picks up Q's explosive pen, and Natalia reprogramming the GoldenEye satellite. The film does juggle a lot of characters. We also get Boris, the brains behind the big plan. Alan Cummings gives an amusing performance as the arrogant Russian computer mastermind who loves word games.
They're right in front of you and can open very large doors.
You're such a geek.
The one thing I always thought was weird was all his word games and passwords are in English. Wouldn't they be in Russian? Of course, in such a mainstream popular film, having a Russian character actually speak Russian would alienate the general audience with having to read subtitles. A lot of people are turned off by that chore. So it's easier just to make all the characters speak English with a Russian accent, even though it would be more realistic if they were speaking their native language.
All right. What's the password?
I'm not going to tell you.
Okay. Let me guess. It's not in front of me.
You sit on it, but you can't take it with you.
What else do you call your bottom?
What?
It's Boris' password. He plays word games. It's what I sit on, but I don't take it with me.
Chair.
So the word game thing I always wondered about. I finally asked a Russian-speaking friend when these English riddles were translated in Russian, would they still be funny, or at least make some kind of sense? According to my comrade, the chair one works, but the knockers one would make no sense at all. It's a small thing, and one could argue that Boris likes playing word games in all languages or something. So these don't necessarily have to be in Russian, but it was always something I thought about when these scenes came up. It's still a clever device to make it more fun when Natalia breaks the code than had it been just a bunch of random numbers.
Burst for brains.
8 years after playing Dalton's nemesis, Brad Whitaker, Joe Don Baker returns to the series playing CIA agent Jack Wade, basically the new Felix Leiter. He fulfills the Felix role by providing Bond with vital information, and his relaxed attitude is a fresh take on a character interacting with Bond. I think it's the first time a character ever calls him Jimbo. We get a new Moneypenny played by Samantha Bond. After years of the required office flirting, we get the first mention of sexual harassment. But that's really the only thing that's worth mentioning from their short scene together. It's pretty forgettable.
James Bond. Charming, sophisticated secret agent. Shaken but not disturbed.
Robbie Coltran as a Russian mobster who has a history with Bond. The whole idea of former enemies are now allies is played out here, with Bond having to go to Valentine for information. This is one aspect of the film that could have been taken advantage of more. The whole dramatic change in Bond's world and Bond finding himself having to adapt to it. Coltrane is funny and the scene is effective. It moves Bond along in the story and gives us some exposition. Lastly, we get the return of Q.
Morning, Q. Sorry about the leg. Skiing?
Hunting.
At this point, Desmond Llewelyn was 81 years old, and his appearance had become a requirement to the series. So it was completely understandable why he was included in the film, and it was nice to see him alive and well. Understandably, at this point, Llewellyn's ability to memorize all the technical dialogue he's meant to say was probably pretty difficult. The solution to this of allowing him to read off cue cards or a monitor is clearly evident. You can see him looking off screen, and it dilutes some of the fun of the normally entertaining scene. Q had always been a cranky character when it came to Bond. Bond not being respectful of his equipment, destroying it, and cracking jokes during the briefings. This relationship worked better when Bond and Q were a little bit closer in age. Now seeing a young man ride an older one doesn't seem as funny as it does cruel. This is lightened up a bit by allowing Q to play along with Bond's jokes more than he had done in the past.
Oh, grow up, 007.
They all said the pen was mightier than the sword.
Thanks to me, they were right.
Giving him a couple of one-liners of his own and almost enjoying their interaction more than in past Q scenes.
Don't say it.
The writing's on the wall?
Along with the rest of it.
By the way, I immediately experienced deja vu at the final joke of this scene.
Do please try and return some of this equipment in pristine order. Don't touch that. It's my lunch.
It's a very similar joke to the one used in the Q scene in Never Say Never Again. One that I thought was executed better and funnier, actually.
What is this for? I'll show you. You unscrew it, then stick it up your nose.
It's for my sinus.
Again, Brosnan seems like he's trying way too hard to be funny in this scene. His reaction to Q grabbing the sandwich from him, he just looks so stiff. Anyway, back to the story. The GoldenEye, a device used to control a satellite weapon, is stolen. General Ormov and Xenia kill all the radar workers while Natalia manages to survive. A really violent and intense scene, whose highlight is the vulnerable Natalia avoiding death as this radar station comes falling down around her. I think it's actually the best action scene in the entire film. Bond begins to follow leads to track down Yanis, head of this crime syndicate that is suspected behind all this. Bond gets a surprise visit by Xenia in a steam room, where she tries to kill him. She's at her sexy, sadistic best in this scene. Brosnan actually seems pretty vulnerable against her. I'm not convinced he realistically would manage to survive this encounter. If there was a battle royale of Bonds, all fighting it out in a ring, I think Pierce's Bond would be the first one out. Okay, well, I'll give him taking out Roger Moore. But Roger would at least have a funny one-liner before getting pummeled. But soon after that, Pierce would follow. I think Brosnan gets his best Bond quips in this scene. Most of the Bond witty remarks and one-liners in the film are not really that good.
The things we do for frequent flyer mileage.
They're not that creative or funny, and they just seem to be there because they're supposed to be. Finally, we get the return of Alec, who reveals himself as Yanis. Alec and Bond's scene set in the Monument Graveyard is a unique location for their reunion. It's not exactly a subtle setting as to the major theme in the film, but still, it's pretty cool. Once again, Bean comes out of the darkness, similar to his first introduction in the beginning of the film. The inevitable reveal is played out nicely, and both Bean and Brosnan do a pretty good job with the scene. It becomes one of the better scenes of the standard villain explaining things. But as the film moves on, his reasons for his big plan become less clear.
And in one of life's little ironies, the son went to work for the government whose betrayal caused the father to kill himself and his wife.
This is true.
What's true is that in 48 hours, you and I will have more money than God.
The world's greatest cash card.
It had better not be rejected.
So I'm not really sure if he's after money or revenge or what. It is kind of odd after all the talk of updating 007 for the post-Cold War era and the 90s. One of Alec's motivations for wanting revenge dates back to World War II. Alec's speech describing Bond as a loyal terrier and revealing a little information about the death of Bond's parents,
but where your parents had the luxury of dying in a climbing accident,
helped make the scene even more memorable. But Bean is pretty good. It's not often that the Bond villain is Bond's physical equal, so that aspect can get exploited for the final fight between them. It's more exciting than the villain just pushing buttons and being kind of a stagnant participant relying on his henchmen to do the dirty work. Bean was one of the candidates for the new Bond, and with that in mind, I can't help but think how different the film and this run in the series would have been had the roles here been reversed. Bean as the new 007 and playing against everyone's good guy, leading contender of being Bond expectations, Brosnan as the evil 006. I'm not sure how it would have worked, but I bet Brosnan would have been more fun to watch as a Bond bad guy than the bland Bond he's playing here. One thing the film really tries to deliver on is the action. There is a lot of machine gun fire. I think Brosnan uses more machine guns in his run than all the other Bonds combined. You almost forget about his Walther PPK. It almost becomes his signature during his Bond run. A lot of machine gun firing and diving out of explosions.
Atom bomb lady, sweet as a bomb, carries more wallop than uranium. When she kisses, there's no hitch. Zero power, she turns on the switch. Atom bomb baby, atom bomb, I want her in my bomb. She's just the way I want it to be. A million times hotter than TNT. Atom bomb baby, atom bomb, I want her in my red bomb. She's just the way I want it to be. A million times hotter than TNT. Atom bomb.
The library shootout is choreographed pretty well, with lots of squibs going off and Bond firing away at any soldier he sees. The biggest set piece is the tank chase in St. Petersburg, and while it's a first in a Bond film, I think it gets pretty boring pretty fast. Chase scenes are a staple in Bond films. Bond is either going to be running from or chasing some bad guys at some point. A lot of times he'll do this in a vehicle, possibly one of Q's gadget-filled cars. One of the exciting things about a chase is not only the speed and destruction, but the obstacles that you have to navigate around while being in your vehicle. With a tank, that element is kind of taken away. Bond doesn't have to worry about running into the giant Perrier truck. He can just barrel right through it, especially if it's loaded with obvious empty Perrier cans. He goes through buildings, runs over cars, so the tank chase becomes more of a demolition sequence than anything else, and I just don't find it as thrilling as other past chases. I like how they add the throwaway shots of these drivers getting out of their smashed vehicles, so we know that Bond didn't just kill them. Even the nonsensical destructive chases in A View to a Kill, with Roger Moore tearing apart Paris and San Francisco, I think are more fun, with Roger having to avoid other cars and pedestrians and trolley cars. I can at least enjoy the staging and driving maneuvers and see that Bond is constantly in jeopardy. Here it's more like, oh yeah, he just plowed through the wall and ran over some police cars. There's not a lot of danger Bond is in during the whole thing. It almost is a perfect metaphor for Brosnan's Bond. A guy who never seems to be in any kind of danger and is just laying a lot of destruction behind him. He's more of a Superman character than a vulnerable secret agent. The train sequence is much better, as Bond uses the tank to derail the train. It's all nicely put together, along with Xenia getting turned on by the whole idea.
Only Bond.
He's going to derail us.
It culminates with Bond being forced to make a decision between killing Alec or saving Natalia. He kills Ormov, Alec and Xenia escape, and he and Natalia get trapped in the locked train that's wired to blow. The classic Bond device of the ticking clock. It's a cool suspenseful scene with Bond trying to cut a hole in the floor and Natalia trying to track down Boris. Their exchanges are funny, and she's not just a scared damsel waiting to be saved, but is barking orders at him, and has a nice edge to her. Actually, Bond seems more panicked to get out of there than she is. They manage to cut their way out of the train, and it's the first and best of the many Brosnan diving from an explosion escapes. Bond and Natalia are naturally going to work together for the rest of the film, so they head off to Cuba. Before heading to the climax of the film, there's a pit stop for a very melodramatic scene on a beach. This is an attempt to get a little closer examination of Bond, as he is now forced to set about killing his former friend. It's a pretty clunky scene, with Brosnan's melodramatic line readings.
How can you act like this? How can you be so cold?
It's what keeps me alive.
It's very soap opera-y. Immediately, the required sex scene follows. We head to the showdown, with Bond and Natalia searching for Alec's big dish. The blue screen and miniatures are obvious, but it still sells the sequence pretty effectively. This segues to the return and end of Xenia. With Bond still recovering from the plane crash, she seems more than capable of killing him. He takes care of her with the help of another machine gun. Her inevitable death is alright. It's not as grisly a death as past henchmen or women have gotten. Bond's required quip,
She always did enjoy a good squeeze.
It did look like the film was going to do the cliched device of making her seem like she's dead, but then suddenly having her pop up later in the film. But no, I guess she's really dead. The big antenna miniatures and the inside set are reminiscent of the old classic Bond villains, especially Blofeld's volcano hideout. A lot of TV screens, different levels, a lot of workers milling about, and all of it just waiting to get destroyed. Alec throws in some more psychological insight into Bond. Some pretty good ones.
I might as well ask you if all the vodka martinis ever silenced the screams of all the men you've killed. Or if you find forgiveness in the arms of all those willing women, for all the dead ones you failed to protect.
His former 00 knowledge about Q's toys easily dismantles Bond's initial plan of setting off his explosives. Natalia shows off some of her toughness again, and she's the one ultimately responsible for destroying the GoldenEye. Which leads us to a very suspenseful scene of Q's pen finally being used, this time by the unsuspecting Boris. Brosnan, for one of the few times, really looks helpless as he just stands by trying to keep track of the pen clicks. It really amps up the tension. I'm not sure if the actual number of clicks we see and hear is the right number, but it doesn't matter. It's still a nice tense scene and leads to the required destruction of the villain's lair. The final showdown between Bond and Alec is well staged on top of the antenna, with again plenty of machine gun fire and running around, but nothing extraordinarily memorable. As expected, their final exchange mirrors what they said at the beginning of the film, as Bond drops Alec to his death. The blue screening here again looks kinda fakey, but Alec's impact on the ground is pretty brutal for a Bond film.
Suppose someone is worth seeing.
There's no one within 25 miles, believe me.
Yo, Jimbo!
There's no Bond water ending here, but they do the old "no one is around to see us" gag. I like GoldenEye, but I don't think it's as great as some proclaim it to be. It's a nice updating of the classic Bond film formula. It has a cool eclectic mix of bad guys, the Bond girl, the femme fatale, Bond's allies. They're all really good. The post-Cold War setting gives a nice atmosphere to everything, and Martin Campbell gets a nice balance between the drama, action, and the humor. I think one of the problems general audiences had with the Dalton films was the cutting back of the more incredible and fun aspects the series had become known for. Watching Dalton's films, some people were probably wondering, why don't they have a guy with metal teeth or something? GoldenEye found that nice balance of providing that aspect of the silly and over-the-top, like Xenia with her nutcracker thighs, while not getting too campy and being able to maintain a grounded reality. There are instances when the things get a little too ridiculous for my taste, but overall I think the film was designed to appeal to everyone. Fans who like their dramatic espionage Bond films, and ones who just want a purely escapist adventure. And GoldenEye succeeds in that regard. But for me, the film isn't perfect and has some key shortcomings. The biggest one is the villain. On paper, it sounds so great. 007 versus 006. Two 00s going head to head. It has the makings of one of the best conflicts the series could ever have for Bond. What should have been a great epic struggle between them, a battle of wits and skills and brawn, is basically just some brawn. with firing some machine guns at each other. It's kinda disappointing. Other than the graveyard scene, Alec and Bond don't really have any great scenes. Their encounters seem way too brief, and the whole build-up between them, waiting for their final confrontation and how it's going to play out, is kind of a letdown. The climax doesn't consist of a unique face-off between Bond and another 00, but just becomes Bond against a generic bad guy villain. Then there's no really great memorable action set pieces or stunts, other than the bungee jump. The rest is by the number shootouts, destruction, and explosions with no real style. The locations aren't really utilized in any original ways. A lot of them simply look like matte paintings or recreated on sets than actual real places. It kind of makes the film look cheap in spots. And then we have Brosnan's one-note performance in the middle of it all. Like I said in the beginning, I am not one of Brosnan's fans, and for me he looks very stiff and awkward and just appears trying way too hard to fill the role the whole time. And for me, he doesn't. He's given all the Bond notes to play. The action, the humor, the sophistication. He has a few moments where he comes off natural in the role, but watching him throughout the entire film, nothing about him on screen really jumps out at me. And I don't think he does any one particular Bond characteristic really well. He's just very unexciting. As the lead character in a film, he's much less interesting and fun to watch than the supporting characters around him. The film overall is not a bad debut, but simply average. Based on his performance in GoldenEye, Brosnan didn't look like he would be doing anything new with the character or putting his own spin on him, but it appeared he would follow the same on-screen persona he cultivated years earlier that made him famous. Sort of like a big-budget Remington Steele. Brosnan's GoldenEye Bond is a very robotic performance. Pierce Brosnan as James Bond. And that's about it. The few times the film gives him opportunities to sink his teeth into some meatier scenes, such as the staring off into the distance, much on his mind scene on the beach, he isn't very convincing. Had Dalton stuck around, and this had been his third Bond film, would it have been better? I don't know. It's one of the great what-if questions in the series. I do think Dalton is a better actor and has a wider range than Pierce does. So I would think, had Dalton starred in GoldenEye, he would have given a more interesting performance than Pierce does here. The story in License to Kill, with Bond out for personal revenge, had mined the anger in the character. So I would think a story of 007 being betrayed by his friend and being forced with the realization he would have to kill him would have been right up Dalton's alley, and he would have taken advantage of the emotional conflicts the story would have given his character this time around. But who knows? Dalton might be widely considered to be one of the closest portrayals of Fleming's original Bond, but I'm not sure general audiences want that, or at least at this point in the series. A less darker and more exhilarating adventure, which GoldenEye is, was what the series needed to reinvigorate it after the 6-year hiatus and the cool reception Dalton had gotten. The timing was right for GoldenEye. When I look at GoldenEye now, it definitely stands out in the Brosnan Age. More for the film itself than Brosnan's debut. Looking at it in the perspective of the entirety of Brosnan's Bond run, it looks and feels more like a holdover film from Dalton than the first sign of where the series would be taken with Brosnan. The story and vision GoldenEye reintroduced Bond into appeared to have plenty of potential for the character and the series. Brosnan waited a long time to be Bond and knew the world would be anxiously watching his debut. He didn't really add anything new to his variation on 007. He mainly played it pretty safe. But now maybe he could relax a bit more, not worry about the ghosts of former Bonds hanging over his head, try his own new things and make the part his own. But for now, Brosnan worked for a lot of fans. Any doubts that 007 could continue in the post-Cold War era quickly disappeared when GoldenEye became a huge success. Brosnan was credited with saving the series and re-established Bond to his iconic film status. He would become the James Bond for a new generation. Unlike the last seemingly endless 6-year hiatus between films, plans were quickly made for the next 007 adventure, and this time fans would only have to wait 2 years for Bond to return.
The Prime Minister's talked to Moscow. They're saying it was an accident during a routine training exercise.
Governments change. The lies stay the same.